So here's a handout that we received today, and this handout, it covers notes that we've already talked about, that we've already covered. Adding and subtracting integers, you think of money. Rules for multiplying: if the signs are the same, the answer is positive. If the signs are different, the answer is negative. We know that the rules for division are the same as multiplication. We already knew about that shortcut, or the storyline that helps us remember that a negative times a negative equals a positive. You can think if a bad thing happens to a bad person, that's good. So, I mean, we've all covered that already. But right now I want to focus in on multiplying fractions and dividing fractions, which we've already done multiplying fractions. Multiplying fractions is really easy. All you have to do is multiply the top number with the top number and the bottom number with the bottom number. Okay, so multiply the numerators together. 1 times 3, you get 3. And then multiply the denominators together. 2 times 5, you get 10. So your answer is 3/10. And of course, you attempt to reduce, but you cannot reduce. So you know that that's simplified, that's done. Number 2, right here you could multiply across and then reduce. And when I say across, I'm not talking like this. I'm talking about top with the top, bottom with the bottom. And then you could reduce at the end. So let's say I did do that. 1 times 2 is 2. And then 2 times 3 is 6. And of course, a negative times a positive. If a bad thing happens to a good person, that's sad, right? That's bad. So that would be a negative answer. So our answer, negative 2/6, it could be reduced by 2. So if you reduce by 2 and reduce by 2, you'll get 1 over 3. And of course, it's still negative. So your answer is negative 1/3. Now, what did we do just there? We multiplied first, and then we reduced. Another option is to take your problem and reduce first. Now, why do I say reduce first? Well, especially if you have the same identical value up on top and on the bottom, you could cancel those out, because 2 on top means that you have the number 2. A 2 on the bottom means that it's divided by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, which means that you could just change them to 1, right? They cancel out, which means that our answer will be, what's left over? You have a negative 1 over 3. So yeah, negative 1/3. You get the same exact answer. So canceling makes things a lot easier. Now, you don't have to cancel. You could multiply the top with the top and get 72, the bottom with the bottom, get a huge number. But as you can see, it's easier to just say, hey, I have a 9 right here and a 9 right there. Okay, so you could cancel out the 9 over 9, because 9 over 9 really becomes 1. I mean, technically, it's not that they disappear. When you divide 9 divided by 9, you end up with a 1 up here and a 1 down there, right? And then, yeah, you're supposed to still multiply 8 times 1, you get 8, and 1 times 32, and you get 32. And also, a negative times a negative will be a positive. But the reason why I'm not multiplying yet is because maybe we could reduce the 8 over 32. Right? We have an 8 up on top and a 32 on the bottom. And if we think about that fraction, 8 over 32, I could reduce by 8, right? Now, if that confuses you, if you don't want to cancel out right here, you could just go ahead and multiply 8 times 1 and get the answer 8. And then over here, 1 times 32 and get the answer 32. And of course, a negative times a negative equals a positive. So I could put a plus sign right here, or I could just leave it like that. So after multiplying, always check and see if you could reduce. So of course you could reduce 8 and 32. If you don't see that you could reduce by 8, you could reduce by 2. You could make this a 4, you can make this a 16. Then you could reduce the 4 further to a 2 and make the 16 become an 8. So you could keep dividing by 2 if you're not really good at reducing. But I see that 8 and 32 could both be reduced by 8. And I'll get 1 over 4. So that would be my final answer, 1/4. Again, I could have, from this point, 8 up on top, 32, I could have seen that it's reducible by 8. So I could have just scratched that out and put a 1. 8 divided by 8 is 1. 32 divided by 8 is 4. And then I could have simply gone to my answer. 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times 4 is 4. And of course, a negative times a negative is a positive. So canceling definitely helps you out a lot. You could cancel a little, you could cancel a lot, like right here. In this problem, we only canceled out the 9s, and then we reduced 8 over 32, which is pretty easy. We got to 1/4. Now, I could have said 8 times 9 and gotten a 72, right? And then I could have done 9 times 32 and gotten a 288. I think that's right. I think I got that on the calculator. And then, of course, you could reduce 72 over 288, but who wants to do that, right? It's easier to just cancel out what you see alike on top and bottom, which makes the numbers nicer, which makes a fraction easier to reduce. Now, let's move on to this next section, dividing fractions, okay? So multiplying fractions is straightforward. It's really easy. You simply multiply the numerator with the numerator and the denominator with the denominator. And of course, if you ever see the same exact thing up on top and on the bottom, like right here, if this were a 5, you would cancel it with this 5 to make things a little easier for you. Dividing fractions is the same thing. If you ever divide by a fraction, what you need to do is change the sign and flip the fraction. Okay, so change, flip. Okay, and that's exactly what it says right here. It says change, flip. I know that if you just read it without me explaining it, it doesn't really make sense. But again, we are going to change the sign and flip the fraction. And we're talking about only the second fraction, okay? So the first fraction is going to stay exactly the way it is. The 1/2 is going to stay 1/2. And the division is going to change to multiplication. And the second fraction, we're going to flip it. So it's going to become 5/3. That's exactly what I mean by over here, change, flip. Okay, so you're going to change the division to multiplication, and you're going to flip the second fraction. You don't mess with the first fraction, you only flip the second fraction. Okay, once again, dividing fractions, whenever you divide by a fraction, you change the division to multiplication, and you flip the second fraction. Don't mess with the first fraction. And that's always true, guys. Let me finish this problem, and then I'll give you something really basic just so you can see. Again, now that you changed it to multiplication and you flip the second fraction, it's really easy. There's nothing to cancel. There's a 5 up here. There's no 5 down here. There's no 5 down here. There's no 3s or 2s up here, so you can't cancel anything. So you simply multiply the numerator with the numerator. 1 times 5 is 5, and then on the bottom, 2 times 3 is 6. And ladies and gentlemen, we are done. 5/6 is the answer. So let's really understand this, that when you divide by a fraction, you are really multiplying by the reciprocal of that second fraction, all right? Again, when you divide by a fraction, you're really multiplying but by the reciprocal of that second fraction. And that's even true, like if I were to say, let me do like 8 divided by 2. That's ridiculously easy. We all know what the answer is 4. But let's use this truth right here, that when you're dividing by a fraction, now I know this is not a fraction, this is a nice natural number, but we could make it look like a fraction. We could put a 1 in there just to force it, just to play with this truth that we're talking about here. Now the 8 is going to stay an 8. The division, we're going to change it to multiplication. And what do I do with this second fraction? I flip it. So it really becomes 1/2, right? So, I mean, think about that. 8 divided by 2, the answer is 4. 8 times 1/2. What's 8 times half? It's also the answer 4. So you see how it remains true, right? So whenever you have division of a fraction, you change it to multiplication and you flip the fraction. I mean, it's the same thing. 8 divided by half is really the same thing as 8 divided by 2 is the same thing as 8 times half. Pretty awesome, right? Math. Let's jump back over here to more problems, more examples. Okay, so some of us might be tempted on number 2 to be like, oh, there's a 2 up here, 2 down there, cancel them. That would be wrong. Don't do that. Why not? Because this is dividing by a fraction. And in order to divide by a fraction, what do? We change the sign and flip the fraction. Only the second fraction. So the first fraction is going to stay exactly the way it is. We are going to change this division to multiplication, and we are going to flip the second fraction that we're dividing by. So that's going to become 3/2 instead of 2/3. And as you could see here, there is nothing alike on top and bottom. Like, there is no 2 up here that I could cancel with this 2 or with that 2. There is no 3s down here that I could cancel with that 3. Now you might be thinking, well, there's a 2 down here and a 2 down there. Yeah, you can't cancel that. The only way something cancels if it's on top and bottom. Remember, happy face over happy face, that cancels out because it's on top and bottom. So in order for the 2's to cancel, you really have to have 1 2 up here and 1 2 down there, and that doesn't work, so we have 2 2's on the bottom. So there's nothing to cancel. What are we going to do? We're simply going to multiply the numerator with the numerator. So 1 times 3 is 3, and 2 times 2 is 4. So our answer is 3/4, and let's not forget about the sign. Negative times a positive equals a negative, okay? A bad thing happens to a good person, that's bad. So let's put a negative on that 3/4, okay? So our answer is negative 3/4. Let's move on to our final example here. And on the back side of this worksheet, you'll see some of these problems that do have division of fractions. And it will be on our first test that we have, which is very likely to be this Friday. So please make sure that you understand multiplying fractions is easy. Dividing fractions is just as easy. Why? Because we change the division to multiplication and flip the second fraction. So the first fraction always stays the same. The second fraction flips, but before flipping, we're going to change the division to multiplication. And yes, we're going to flip the second fraction. The 4 is going to be on the bottom. The 33 is going to be on top. And of course, it's still a negative. Okay. So now we could either multiply 8 times 33 and get a huge number, and 9 times 4 and get 36. But notice that we could reduce things. Like this 8 up here and this 4 down here. 8 on top, 4 on the bottom. 8 on top, 4 on the bottom. 4 on the bottom means divided by 4. 8 up on top, 8 divided by 4. What happens when you have 8 divided by 4? The answer is 2. And where does that answer belong? Up on top. So up on top, we end up with a 2. Okay? And we could multiply 2 times 33 now and then reduce by 9. Or we could think about this. 33 over 9. 33 over 9. We know that this is divisible by 3 and this is divisible by 3. Okay? So we could reduce by 3 if we wanted to, and let's do that just to make the numbers a little bit easier. So the 33 divided by 3 becomes 11. 9 divided by 3 becomes 3. So what do we have left here? Well, we have 2 times 11, so that answers 22. And we also have 3 times 1, because remember when it cancels out it's really a 1. 3 times 1 is 3. So we have 22 over 3. And let's think about the signs. What is a negative times a negative? That is a positive. If a bad thing happens to a bad person, that's good. Okay, so that's a positive 22 over 3. That's an improper fraction. I will totally accept that. That's awesome. That's a perfect answer. But however, there are some math teachers that prefer mixed fractions. So just to remind you how to do that, you take the 22 and divide it by 3. So 22 goes inside the box, 3 goes on the outside of the box. And you think, how many times will 3 go into 22 without going over? Well, 3 times 7 is 21, and when you subtract, you have a remainder of 1. So how do we write our improper fraction to a mixed fraction? Well, the 7 is the whole number, the natural number, and the 1, the remainder of 1, let me do it in red, that remainder goes above the original divisor. What did we originally divide by? By 3. So the answer is really 7 1/3. So either one's acceptable in my class, but I know that sometimes certain tests, they don't write them as improper fractions, they write them as mixed numbers. So I hope this video helps on multiplying and dividing fractions. On the next video, we're going to talk about exponents. So we'll pick that up on the next video.